Hello and welcome. We are going to talk about the big events of the last 24 to 48 hours. The biggest, obviously, is the Russian retreat that has begun from Kherson. We also have developments on other parts of the front. We are going to talk about that too, and there are more informations about the mobilization, about political developments, political scheming, and international support for Ukraine and Russia in this war. Let's first start with the report from the Eastern Frontier. It's likely that the Ukrainian troops are now in Novoselivsk. The Russians are also reporting Ukrainian attacks on Kuzymivka, but they say they defeated them. They are also saying that the Ukrainians are attacking between Maklivka and Ploshanka on this line, more or less, and they are reporting heavy attacks in the direction of Crimea, but they are saying the Russians are doing counterattacks to stop the Ukrainians from developing their offensive, to basically disturb them setting up the offensive conditions. Further south, we have reports from Bilohorivka. We have a video confirming Russian troops in the southern part of town. But at this point, it is unclear who is that, because initially the reports were that it was troops from the so-called LNR, the so-called Luhansk People's Republic, while by now the claims are that it's Wagner troops that are actually in there, again probably in the context of the power struggle that Prigozhin wants to make himself and his troops bigger than they might actually be. So at this point we cannot say which troops are there in place, but we do have visual confirmation of Russian troops having re-entered the town. Further south, we have the usual attacks from more or less Bakhmut, a little north of it, usually down to Vuhledar. When we go to the area here, so more or less the attacks started recently. I have no report of recent attacks on Spirne, but further south down to Vuhledar, which is here in this area, the Russians keep attacking. The Ukrainians have now said at Bakhmut it's more or less exclusively Wagner, so the Ukrainian side is now confirming Prigozhin's claim in this regard, at least. The Russians are saying they have entered Bakhmut. It might be possible. I've seen some images which I was not able to geolocate, so it could be that they have actually entered the outskirts, but we never know. There is some fighting north of Ivangrad. We had reports that they have conquered Ivangrad, so where exactly that fighting might be, whether it's here or here, is unclear, but they seem to be in built up areas that could more or less be described as a part of Bakhmut. Further south, we have the further reports about attacks around Avdiivka. Nothing new here. We have more reports that the Russians have successfully, confirmations now that the Russians have successfully conquered the airport, which is here, the International Donetsk Airport. There is also now reports about attacks in various different directions, even though a lot of it cannot be confirmed, and in a lot of places we don't have geolocalization when it comes to the sparse video and pictures that have appeared from this. Further south, we have the Russians. First, the Ukrainians are saying the Russians are attacking Pavlivka, which is here, in the direction of Vodiane, which is here, and Novomikhailivka, I think it should be pronounced. So in this direction, more or less, they are attacking along this line here. The Russians are saying the Ukrainians are themselves doing counterattacks in Pavlivka and Novomikhailivka, and they say both sides more or less claim that they have stopped the other side. The Russians are also saying Ukrainians are bringing reinforcements towards Pavlivka and Novomikhailivka. There is, though, now very recently, like within the last few hours, we have some reports that not just that the Russian forces have suffered heavy losses at Pavlivka, but now we have some images of them raising a flag, which could not be fully geo-confirmed at this point. So it seems to be in Pavlivka. They definitely have taken some houses in Pavlivka. This much seems to be sure as of now, but we can't confirm yet whether they control the whole town or not. But they have entered Pavlivka after all. That much should more or less be sure. In recent proclamations by the Russian military, they are claiming though that they have full control over Pavlivka now. The advisor to the Ukrainian mayor from Mariupol is saying that the Russians are actually starting fortification works far further south. He said that they are starting to lay mines and put up dragon teeth, and there were a couple of towns being mentioned, and from my understanding it should be more or less west of Mariupol in this direction, but one town mentioned was, I think, Prokhorivka. So unless there's one close to here, the defensive line might actually go more or less like this, but I cannot confirm this at this point. The towns that I could identify were west of Mariupol itself, so supposedly the Russians are building defensive positions in front of Mariupol in case of a further Ukrainian attack later. On the southern front, we have the reports, the not too surprising reports about artillery fire from both sides, and Russian strikes deeper into the territory. One thing is interesting though, that the Russians specifically named a Su-35 using a Kh-31 against a Ukrainian air defense system. It missed, they said. Kh-31 is fairly modern. It has anti-ship missile versions, but it also has a version that can be used against radar systems, so it would be more or less, it could be more or less compared to the HARM missile that has been used very successfully by the Ukrainians. In this regard, just worth mentioning that the Russians do have the same systems, or comparable systems at least, even though they seem to be in far fewer supply, and the Russians are not actively conducting SEAD campaign, so suppression of enemy air defenses, like American viewers would know and expect it from their own military in this regard. But that doesn't mean they don't use systems to suppress Ukrainian air defense systems. From the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, we have news that Energoatom, which is the Ukrainian atomic energy organization, they are saying they are raising the boni for the workers at the power plant from 20 to 50% for everyone who stays loyal to Ukraine. And the British, I'm not completely sure, it's probably should have probably been with Crimea, but I did my script. I mean, it's not really scripted. Most of you will understand that I just have a few points here that I'm working from, but that point should have probably been with Crimea, but I have it here. So the British Ministry of Defense is saying the Kerch Bridge will not be fully usable until September of 2023. That is obviously really far in the future, and will have a lasting effect on the battlefield if the Russians can actually not use the Crimean Bridge, which is essential for the heavy traffic in this whole area, as it's the only heavy train line that is functional. If they can't use that, if they keep having to send trucks along the northern route to supply, that's obviously is going to impact the Russian logistics for months to come, if the British are right in this regard. When it comes to Kherson, we have the video of the conversation. I'm just going to turn off my camera for a moment and let you watch it, where you can see the explanations. It's obviously staged. I mean, I think in my understanding, it's more than obvious that this is staged, but you can see here how both sides, that's Surovikin. So he's the commander of the Russian forces in Ukraine now, and he's suggesting that they take the troops back. And Shoigu, who is the minister of defense for Russia, is then giving his permission. And he says we have to take it back to save the lives and keep the units combat ready, etc., because of the difficult situation on the other bank of the Dnipro. So he's saying it's going to generate additional forces, like I mentioned in the latest video, which obviously will allow them to rearrange troops again. I think we should probably, I mean, you know already what it's about, and I'm not going to waste an additional minute of our time. You'll find the video in probably an hour or two after this video is being published on the website. so you can watch it yourself if you're interested in this. Surovikin was proposing the retreat, and Shoigu was accepting, but he insisted that he needs to make sure the safe withdrawal of troops, weapons and material. This is obviously important in the context of this war, as the Ukrainians have captured more in their offensives than NATO has actually delivered to them, and that the Russians have actually learned from that. We were able to see in the northern area here, we didn't see a single is exaggerated, but we did not see the big haul of loot that we would have expected, the big haul of captured equipment from the Russians in the northern part of Kherson, when the Ukrainians overran the positions there and forced the Russians to retreat. So it seems like they're improving their way to make sure that they don't actually arm their own enemies. Surovikin additionally said that half of the troops they are withdrawing will be used somewhere else. It's highly likely that he's going to send them in this area where the most likely next Ukrainian attack is going to come. And it's obvious at this point that such an important decision, whether to withdraw over the Dnipro, and I said it in the other video, this is a strategic defeat for Russia. It should not be underestimated, understated what happened here. This will not have happened without Putin's approval, and we can read something out of this, which is that Putin, at least as of now, has understood the severity of the situation. There are some estimates, some analysis and some guesses, some of it done by me as well, which said that Putin probably has in the meantime, or at least he had at some point, lost touch. That's a typical thing for dictatorships, where presenting bad news is bad for your career or even for your own health, that the reporting gets more whitewashed the higher it gets. So in this regard, that Putin never understood, or initially didn't understand the real situation, didn't have a full grasp about Ukraine's capabilities, about how the war was actually going for Russia. That seemed extremely likely. That he now gave permission is a sign that his understanding of the actual situation is massively improving, and probably that Surovikin is taking those hard choices also shows that he's willing to make decisions that are unpopular, at least would be considered unpopular, but are necessary. So Surovikin might actually lead to an improvement of the Russian performance in this war. We have a funny thing on the Russian television. And this is actually something that is worth seeing. I'm going to turn off my camera again. I think it's only a minute. But here is a Russian TV host understanding that he doesn't have free speech and that he's in trouble, because he says if he says it's the right decision to withdraw the troops, then he's basically supporting handing over Russian territory to an enemy, which is punishable because it's like against the Russia's territorial integrity. It's punishable by years of prison according to Article 280 Part 1. But if he says that the military does the wrong decision, here several years in prison, if he says the military made a wrong decision, then he is saying that the defense ministry has been wrong, and that is discrediting the armed forces, which is Article 280 again, but Part 3, and also brings several years of prison of potential jail time, and he doesn't want to go to prison, he's saying this. So I thought it's like an anecdote. It's not really, the news value of this is obviously limited, but it's kind of amusing to see how the TV commentators are struggling, how the TV hosts are struggling to comment the developments when they are so restricted in their free speech. The withdrawal is currently happening. When we come to the military part, it's currently happening, and it seems to be accompanied by retreating battles. So the Russians are withdrawing, and it's not that it's without battles. There are reports about artillery fire, which kind of makes sense, as every Russian artillery that is still there it will not be able to bring home its artillery shells. It's nonsense to expect that the Russians will use their limited amount of artillery, of transport capacity to transport shells that they can probably replace the easiest. So the logical way is to use them up by firing them at the Ukrainians as long as they can. And as I mentioned before, the mud period has fully started, and while it's less severe in the south, it's still a mud period. So the Ukrainians, if they want to advance fast enough, they need to more or less stick to the roads most of the time, which obviously makes it much easier to shell them, as you can predict their axis of advance in this regard. There are also reports about a lot of bridges being blown up, so the Russians are destroying everything of military value and of logistics value to the Ukrainians, as the new front line is to be expected to be along the river, and every bridge that is blown up here will obviously hinder the Ukrainians of bringing ammunition forward, supply, etc. So it makes a lot of sense for the Russians to blow it up. Right now, there seems to be indications that the Ukrainians don't actually intend to force Russian collapse of the front line. There are no reports of the Ukrainians pushing ahead with their full strength, trying to collapse the Russian defenses, whereas this would be the perfect position for that. We can obviously just guess what it's for. There are some more rumors, as usually, on Twitter, where some claim there might be a deal between the Russians and the Ukrainians to allow for their withdrawal. This is not unheard of in history. It's a normal thing, a fairly normal thing in history, that if the attacker thinks his costs of winning the battle might be too high, but the price of gaining a strategic position is big enough that he allows the defender to withdraw, sometimes even with his full equipment, with his full arms. So in theory, that's a possibility, but we should not forget that we had the same rumors when it came to the Russian withdrawal from Liman, and a few days later we found videos of artillery having reaped what the harvest, I think, is the correct saying. So that artillery created heavy losses among the Russians that were withdrawing, despite some rumors that there might have been a deal. So whether there is a deal now, it's theoretically possible. I can't really say how likely it is. It seems unlikely to me. But we shouldn't forget that the Russians are still they aren't broken, so they are still capable of fighting back, and obviously the defender usually has the advantage. So if the Ukrainians push in too hard, they might suffer unnecessary losses. Then there's obviously the danger of mining. The Russians have extensively mined the whole area, so any wrong step, any wrong move can blow up people and material. And we can expect the Russians to having planted explosive booby traps, etc., to also slow it down, in combination with the artillery fire, where I mentioned that they more or less know the axis of advance from the Ukrainians, so they can stop them this way too. So a lot of maybe ifs and whatever, but what we can see is that there are no indications of the Ukrainians trying to force a collapse of the Russians. Whatever the reason is, we can't really say, but it looks like it. And while we have a first video of a captured tank, we see here a T-90A, easy to recognize with the Stora active defense system here, what we see next to the turret and next to the barrel. But while this video is appearing, while we have images of the image proof of some equipment that was captured, I would think it's fairly unlikely that Ukraine is going to end up with immense wins like they've achieved in other offensives, because the withdrawal as of now seems to be fairly organized. The Russians have likely prepared it for several weeks. That press conference we saw, that TV thing, was staged to sell the withdrawal to the audience, to the domestic audience, to the military bloggers. It is not a decision that was made there ad hoc. We heard weeks before about the Russian withdrawal, so everything that was of value that isn't in need of direct combat at the front line will already be over the bridge, and the rest will likely be either mined, or if they have to give it up, they will try to blow it up to not continue arming Ukraine. I mean, even everyone in the Russian army should know by now what those defeats meant in the past, how they meant arming the Ukrainian armed forces. Generally, we will be able to say a lot about the state of the Russian armed forces with this withdrawal. It'll show us how well discipline, morale, and functioning command structures are right now. This is, as I like to say, as I like to mention on this channel, this withdrawing from an enemy who is in contact with one is one of the most difficult maneuvers that a military can do. So it's extremely difficult to lose control of the situation and then be overrun if the enemy pushes. We might have some doubts that the Ukrainians are actually trying, but the stated goal of the Russians is to get over the river with as much equipment and basically with all their equipment and all their personnel. When we can see the numbers of when the battle is over, the battle for Kherson is over, we will probably have some opportunity to find out numbers of captured personnel, of captured equipment, and depending on the size of those numbers, we should be able to see how disciplined they are, because it obviously requires discipline and morale to stand in a position when the rest of your comrades are already retreating. And it shows the command structure, because all of this has to be synchronized. It has to be well organized to not create big blobs of men at the ferry points that are easy to shell, etc. So this has to be well planned. It has to be well planned. The commanders have to do a good job in this regard. The discipline and the morale has to hold up. We will be able to say a lot about the Russian armed forces once this is over. It's too early for that right now, though. And the Ukrainian, when we summarize the whole situation, well, then we can say the Ukrainian plan to cut the supply lines over the Dnipro has been successful. It's the most logical reason for this withdrawal. Obviously, the destruction of the Kerch Bridge has made a massive impact as well, as within the last months, the possible supply for the Russians must have declined visibly and hurtfully. As you can obviously only get over the river what's actually on your own side of the river, and with the bridge being taken out, more or less being taken out, this seems likely that the Russians have had massive problems with supplying their forces on the other side. Russia will now have to bring all their supply to this area, or is continuing to have the problem that they have to use trucks, but they have to use increasing numbers of civilian trucks, as their military truck fleet has also suffered massive losses, which the Russians can't easily replace. And the difference in both is obviously the ruggedness of the military in comparison to the civilian ones. So the losses in supply and the losses in capability should also be recognizable on the front line. They will keep hurting the Russians in this regard. Kherson will likely be freed within the next few days, but it will fully remain within the range of Russian artillery, actually even in mortar range. So unless the Ukrainians manage to cross the river right away afterwards, which seems extremely unlikely, it means that Kherson at the end of all of this will probably be looking like Mariupol. It's going to be a field of ruins, as the Russians can be expected to shell it mercilessly over the coming month, even not necessarily just to destroy the city, but obviously we can expect Ukrainian military presence in the city as well. So while the military will have won there, the civilians definitely haven't with this victory here, as the Russians have brought over a lot of artillery to keep shelling it from now on. In addition to that, there will be the mines and the booby traps. Depending on the preparation time, it's fairly likely that big explosives have been planted. As I said in the past, the Russians more or less know where likely positions of the Ukrainians are. They are in place, and they know that a certain place is ideal to position resupply vehicles. A certain place is likely to contain barracks, sleeping opportunities, etc., etc. All of this is known to the Russians, and depending on the time they had to prepare their withdrawal, it's fairly within the realm of possibility that they've placed big explosives there, maybe even with time delays. So the Ukrainians settle down, expect nothing, and in 3 weeks from now, hundreds of kilos of TNT might blow up and cause massive losses. We will have to see if the Russians had the time to do that, but that they know what it is, that they know it's a possibility. It's not just obvious. We actually have reports about that in Nova Kakhovka, that they did exactly that, place explosives there to be ready to blow up the ground under the Ukrainian soldiers once they are there. So that can be really difficult for the Ukrainian troops there, and very cause high losses despite the Russians not even being on that side of the river anymore. And we have an indication because Surovikin already said on October 19th that hard decisions are necessary when it comes to Kherson. This gives them 3 weeks, more or less. 19th, yeah, more or less 3 weeks of, no, I think exactly 3 weeks of preparation time when it comes to this, which could, in theory, be enough to do all of this, especially as for explosives like that, they don't necessarily need to bring in new explosives. They could use big piles of artillery shells, etc. for that as well, at least with some addition of a primer, fuse, etc. Ukraine will have the military advantage of freeing Kherson. As already said, they will be able to shorten their front line. They will be able to redeploy troops, but the civilians will not find peace over that. And obviously, the Russians will also benefit that they themselves can also reshuffle their troops and send them somewhere else. Where they send them will give us an indication of the state of the troops as well. Obviously, if they actually redeploy them right back to the front line, we can either expect the losses to be somewhat limited, or we can expect expended units to not get rest but keep being reused, which will not help their combat power. That this is going to be a trap, like some commentators said on videos. I'm pretty sure when you Google the well-known commentators about this war, they are talking about a potential trap by Russia when it comes to Kherson. I said it from the beginning when I heard about it. This is nonsense to me, because any reasonable trap, any reasonable ambush is not possible because of the river. The only possibilities aren't really traps. Like in theory, they could have a nuclear mine there, but the video that I think was published yesterday on the English channel, and I forgot to reschedule it. That's why the views are horrible, so go watch it. The video from yesterday says that Russia is not going to use nukes anytime soon. A nuclear mine is not going to. So a nuclear mine is close to impossible of being used in this regard. What we will see is some booby traps, but I could not consider that by any reasonable means as a trap when the Russians are shelling them and are preparing them. So whatever some people talked about a potential trap, I don't see any of this here. I think it's a genuine withdrawal. They will try to cause as much damage to the Ukrainians who follow up, but that's not a trap. That's normal behavior in a military, where you try to defeat your opponent in no matter whether you are on the attack or on the defense. It is a big defeat of the Russians, where there is no way of them being able to hide it. It's impossible for them to sugarcoat it. We see here Riba, one of the big channels where I like to use their maps, etc. One of the really professional and huge Russian Telegram channels are saying here, like, in the eyes of the population, this is a defeat. So there's no sugarcoating about the situation. It is a defeat. But we have to see it's Russian territory according to Russia, because they have annexed Kherson, the oblast, as well. So all of this here, what they're giving up now, supposedly is Russian territory. That's now falling into the hands of the enemy, and with them withdrawing over the river, it seems extremely unlikely that they are returning anytime soon again. Part of the military blockers are supporting it though, and they say it was necessary, and Surovikin did the necessary thing, and they praise him for showing the willingness to take the hard decision, which actually is speaking in his favor. And we have Prigozhin praising him, and we also have here, I have Kadyrov for you, who is also praising him. That, as you can see, I fully agree with Mr. Prigozhin's opinion on Surovikin's decision. You have the two of them mentioned. Obviously, it's not in English. I translated. I used Google Translate to show it to you in English. Kirill Stremusov, that's something else now. Kirill Stremusov. Oh, okay. Somehow, where did it go? Okay. I guess I made a mistake again, but let me quickly fix that. Kirill Stremusov was the deputy head of the occupation administration in Kherson. He was a Ukrainian turncoat. He switched to the Russian side here, and the day they announced the withdrawal, he died. He was apparently using an armored car, and we can see the chassis. No, what is it called? Like the wheels. This isn't really the chassis, in my understanding. So you basically see the ground where the chassis is on top, and the chassis has obviously flown off. Now, there are some rumors this could have been explosives. I can't really see direct signs of explosives, but again, I want to emphasize I'm not an explosive expert, so somebody might see something that I'm missing, and that's perfectly fine because I have simply no clue. I mean, I don't see blackening that would come from fire or explosives, but it might be a genuine accident, because we have here RIA Novosti, the Russian news outlet, saying it's a truck driver who made a dangerous maneuver. So the driver of Stremusov had to try to avoid a collision, and that made him lose control, and the chassis was taken off from the wheels and probably flew around and was rolling away. But that it was on the same day of the Russian withdrawal is obviously now causing the question whether you can fall out of a window in an armored car. So basically accusing, or asking, at the very least asking, whether Stremusov was actually killed by the FSB for whatever reason. We now have pictures from Fortifications. Further pictures, we have it here in Ula Pristan, where you can see this is it's not directly at the Dnieper yet, if I understand it, but we can see we have nice pictures here of the prefabricated bunkers or pillboxes the Russians are creating and getting ready to set up. I'm pretty sure this is obviously not their final position yet, but we can see they are cast from concrete, and they are actually having solid steel doors to prevent them. And we see here the openings to shoot out from. It's probably good enough to hold, as I said in the past, to hold back small arms fire, and depending on the position, it can make perfect sense to use that. Especially, you can also dig it into if necessary. That this is capable of withstanding an anti-tank guided missile, full hit with a 155 artillery shell or the 125 shell from a tank is more or less unlikely at my rudimentary understanding when it comes to the penetration values. Obviously, depending on the shell, but that an ATGM that is made to cut through 1000 millimeters of rolled homogeneous armor is not capable of going through, how much will that be, 20 centimeters of concrete, is fairly unlikely, if it's even 20 centimeters. That doesn't mean those things here are useless though. So as said, they have value, they allow observation, they allow using small arms fire, and they should more or less protect from small arms from what I see. We have more here. More fortification works. This is from somewhere in Kherson. We don't know where. Let me quickly show Hula Pristan just before we finish. It's here. So the water we saw in the background was one of those canals or sidearms of the Dnipro. So it's not directly on the front line, but they were obviously just parked there. What we have here is a video from Kherson, and we see the Russians doing additional fortification work. We see an excavator here, either ready to place those dragon teeth or maybe digging tank ditches. But we see they continue to use dragon teeth, and in this regard I found a nice video that is showing them a Russian test that is being spread around the Russian internet, Telegram, that's showing the Russians testing the Wagner line, the dragon teeth, trying to show how good they are, how well they are made. We see a single dragon tooth here. It's obviously how slow he drives against it. I guess you could argue that it was meant to prevent damage, and as soon as he accelerates, it starts digging into the ground, and then, as we can see, they are claiming it's lifting the tank up. So as we can see, as I said, they are very careful. Probably, I mean, it kind of makes sense if you expect the tank to be damaged, and as we can see, the track here is just uselessly spinning around. What this doesn't show, though, first of all, we only see one track moving, not the other one, which could be, and the other one should be the one still on the ground. I mean, if you place them tight enough, there might be one on the other side too. But what it doesn't show, what it shows us, it still shows us a couple of things. First of all, the tank was easily able to move it because they are too light. Some people in my video about them in the past did the math, and they said the lowest estimate I had was like 400 kilos, or even less, I think 350 kilos. What's that? 750 pounds of those blocks here. So they aren't that heavy. If the Russians have, the Soviet Union had shields, digging shields. I'm not completely sure about the correct terminology in English, but basically it's like small shields at the front that they can be lowered and used by the Soviet tanks to dig their own protection, to dig into the ground, to have additional protection by earth mounts around them. And if the Ukrainians are using them on those dragon teeth, they should be more or less able to push them aside without any big problem in this regard, no matter what that video is supposed to show us. When it comes to the developments on the front, they are fairly fluid right now. I have just two, so I just took two significant towns that are confirmed to be liberated. Obviously, it's far more at this point because the Russians are withdrawing. We have Snihorivka now being confirmed as liberated, and like an hour before I took that video, we have confirmation that the Ukrainians now control Vyselivka, which means they are advancing towards Kherson, and they are just, we see it, they are just 20 kilometers away from the Dnipro at that point when it comes to Kherson itself. That was it here on the site, on the front line. Before we come to additional developments when it comes to Crimea, partisans, mobilization, etc., let's do a quick summary. The Ukrainian plan to increase the usage of supplies on the other side of the Dnipro, to cut the supply lines, or to at least to reduce their capacity, was definitely helped by the destruction or heavy damage to the Kerch Bridge. Whether that's the one that tilted the sides is not completely easy to determine, but it definitely helped at this point. So the Russians are now doing the right thing. If they are successful in withdrawing their troops intact, that's going to be the big question. Then they've lost a strategic position, which will hurt them a lot. But when it comes to their fighting power, they will have actually improved them. They might actually improve the fighting power, because those units will then be in better supply, as there is no longer the need to go over the river. This makes the troop concentration along the rest of the front lines higher, because both sides will after that reshuffle their troops. Generally, the defender is in an advantage when it comes to a shortening of front line, because he can place more troops to defend his front line. But we have the different position here that Ukraine is on the offensive as the defender. So Ukraine, while being in the offensive, has the advantage of the inner lines, which means for them, shuffling troops from Orikhiv to, let's say, Kupiansk is, obviously, it's roads in between and everything, but it's 275 kilometers. Whereas if the Russians do the same, and we try to be more or less the same way here, we are having 100 kilometers additional. So the Ukrainians will have a much easier time after the defeat in Kherson to concentrate their troops, and as an attacker it's there, as they still have the initiative, as they have the strategic initiative. It's them who decide that where the attacks are going to happen, so their troop concentration matters much more than the defensive concentration of the Russians, as the Russians will then have to react. It strengthens the Russian positions along the front line here, obviously, because up to the highest estimate I ever heard about the troops in Kherson were 45,000 men. We were talking about roughly a third, roughly 40 plus battalion tactical groups here, so a third of the combat power of the Russian armed forces. 40 additional battalion tactical groups, even though we can question how intact they are and how well equipped they are, etc., can obviously make a difference. But the Ukrainian side, as I said in the last video on this channel about this topic, might free up to 6, 7, 8, maybe even 10 brigades on their own, which is more than they used on this breakthrough. So in general, Ukrainian position will improve. It saves Mykolaiv and Odessa, and taking Kherson back, getting control over one shore of the Dnipro will improve their situation. But for Kherson itself, it'll probably end badly, as it's going to be shelled over the next coming months, unless the Ukrainians somehow manage to get over the river and extend their front line in the direction of Crimea, which is, as said, questionable but not impossible, but I would not count on it. Further here, the usual things: Russian initiative along this line, Ukrainian initiative along this line. And as we already mentioned, Crimea, I'm not the only one talking about Crimea. The Russians are actually doing it themselves as well. Nope, that was the wrong one. Again, made a mistake in my organization. So we now have satellite image that images that the Russians are improving their fortification in Crimea, in northern Crimea. You can clearly see a trench being dug here for infantry usage. We see other trenches here. We see they are mentioned some of the positions. We can see them here. You can clearly see that they existed before and they are now being redug, refreshed, updated, etc. Those are supposedly those are the old fortification systems that date back to the point when Russia only controlled Crimea and the Ukrainians were on the other side. This shouldn't be overestimated again. We shouldn't call this that the Russians actually think that the Ukrainians are about to invade Crimea. In a military sense, if they have additional capacities and they can use an excavator, a civilian excavator that's used for nothing else, so that would use to build a shed otherwise, it makes perfect sense. To create fallback positions that are never needed is far better to not have fallback positions when you need them. What the Russians are doing here is not a sign that they expect the Ukrainians to be right at the entry of Crimea in the next 4 weeks. It's just a preparation for the eventuality, because this is war and they are clearly on the defensive at several parts of the front line, and that might go badly. So preparing defensive lines here and around Mariupol is not actually the stupidest thing, because if they never need them, then they've used some concretes and some excavators, but what's the big harm of it? So we should somehow keep it within certain limits. From Odessa, I also have a news that the Ukrainians are saying they destroyed a anchored mine that was drifting on the shore after a storm. That's kind of interesting, because the Ukrainians claim it was Russian, and unless it was one of their own and for whatever reason they want to claim it was Russian, which is always possible. Again, at least once a video I should remind my viewers that just because one side says it and that one side lies a little less doesn't mean they never lie or they don't make mistakes. It could be an honest mistake here. Obviously, I guess a mine could be identified by some serial number, but the Ukrainian anchor mines should be more or less, at least to a certain degree, the same as the Russians, if both sides use mines old enough, and there's no reason to get rid of them when they are still in working order. That the Russians would use mines doesn't make too much sense, because the Ukrainians don't really have a navy. And an anchor mine has to be understood that, like the saying is, it has an anchor, which is a solid block that is very heavy. that is supposed to drop down to the floor, and the mine itself is lighter than water, so it rises up to the surface. It's connected with a cable, and depending on how long you set the distance between the anchor and the mine, that's how you set how far above the bottom of the sea that mine is afterwards situated. So you have to calculate how deep the water is at the point you do it, and you have to know what ships you can expect. And the only ships with any serious, I think draft is the word for it, so how deep they lie in the water, the only ships of serious draft that are around there are civilian cargo ships now doing the grain deal, which seems, it's possible that the Russians try to mine it, but it doesn't seem too likely. Ukraine doesn't have any serious ships anymore that have a draft that is more than a couple dozen of centimeters. And the biggest threat that's coming from the Ukrainian side right now is the drone boats that are suicidal, but they're like that are to be blown up, like suicide boats more or less. But their draft will not be over 15-20 centimeters, which would mean the mines basically have to be on the surface. So why the Russians would use those mines doesn't really fully explain to me. I think it's actually a fair possibility that this was a Ukrainian mine. Either the Ukrainians tried to frame it against the Russians, or that they didn't know better and just expected it to be a Russian mine. But offensive or even defensive mine warfare from the Russian side against in regard to what the potential threat against them is doesn't make too much sense. At least I don't see the real reason. The Ukrainians have some swimming things, but anchor mines don't seem the appropriate tool against that. But again, maybe I'm not seeing some reasoning for it that you do. In that case, I'm happy to see you comment that to write that in the comment section to explain to me and to us why you think the Russians should use anchor mines. Regardless of that, we have reports from partisan activity too. The Russians are saying they arrested a group of Ukrainian militants, as they call them, in Berdyansk, which is here. The Russians are saying they stopped a Ukrainian, as they call it, terrorist attack against a gas installation, and gas in natural gas sense, not gasoline, here in Novy Dar in Luhansk. And the Ukrainian mayor of Melitopol is saying that partisans have attacked the headquarters of the occupation authority, which is at the outskirts of Melitopol. And we see here the image and the place burning up in this regard. When it comes to the mobilization, we have news that there are still informations coming in. Big parts of the mobilization of the mobilized men still seem to be paid by the regions, not by the federal government, which is a little bit surprising and would be an indication that the federal government doesn't have enough money to hand over that responsibility to the regions. But they are in financial trouble too, at least the majority of them. There is a lot of the mobilized men have not received their bonus payment that they were supposed to receive. We have reports about protests from several places here. We have news from mobilized men in Ulyanovsk who said they only received 1,500 ruble for 1.5 months of service. That's $25. Even for Russia, that's really little. And then there are reports that volunteers which are supposed to get twice as much signing bonus at the very least than the called up reserves, that they have simply been registered as called up reserves and thus they don't receive their additional pay for being a volunteer. That could be done with the intention to save money, or that could have been a mistake, but that it's not good for their morale is more than obvious in this regard. At times, only a fraction of the boni were paid, and we have the news from Kuban, which should be across from Crimea. I think that's Kuban here, if I'm not completely wrong. I think at least. So in Kuban, the reports are that families didn't receive the money that they were supposed to receive for having basically handed over some family member to the armed forces, but they received firewood. Okay. Further reports about the equipment, further reports about so that the equipment is horrible and insufficient. We have reports about protests by women, by mobilized men, by civilians everywhere around. We have now opposition media saying that more and more companies are suffering from a drastic shortage of manpower, of skilled workers, as we can more or less guess that the mobilized men should be more or less the healthy ones, the educated ones, the sane ones, and them being drafted, then them being called up, while at the same time more than 700,000 have fled the country, will create a worker shortage that will also hurt the Russian war effort in this regard. And then we have Ukrainian general staff again with the limitation that it has an interest to sell us propaganda, us and its own domestic audience, and they say soldiers are getting helmets in some places out of coming from dating back to the Second World War, and that some of the protective gear they're getting, their vests more or less, their flak jackets, are from the 60s and 70s, and as the development of the materials has massively advanced since then, we can more or less expect that a vest from the 60s and 70s isn't really useful anymore, except for adding weight to the armed forces. At least that's what I remember from my army time. In 2001, we still had flak jackets that were good enough to stop a splinter. Direct hit by a bullet was without any chance. It would go through like nothing. And that's at least how we learned that they are useful or not useful. And the Ukrainian general staff is saying that a big part of the weapons doesn't work because of bad storage, and they call it a big part now. What is a big part? Among 400, officially 300,000 mobilized, likely 500,000 to maybe even more. If 10,000 weapons don't work, that's a big part. But that's nothing that the Russians can't replace, that they shouldn't be able to find 10,000 working parts. It would still be a big part. So to take this literally, to expect that the Ukrainian armed forces are now telling us a significant part of the mobilized men don't have working guns when they enter the trenches on the Ukrainian front, I think we should not believe this at this point. There were some images of completely rusted up guns, but other reports said, yeah, those were like one box or two boxes, and the same unit then got fresh guns in good quality to replace those boxes where the storage had failed. So whether that is true, that their guns actually don't work, seems fairly unlikely in my understanding. We also have reports, when we come to the political side, that the Russians are collecting data of citizens, of Ukrainians that don't want to get evacuated. The report still came while the Russians hadn't announced their withdrawal yet, but it's also coming from the other shore of the Dnieper. They are supposedly writing down the names of everyone who refuses to get evacuated, including the reason for that, which then indicates that it might lead to some prosecution later on. According to as they write down the reason, it would more or less allow somebody to judge, well, that sounded legitimate, and that was probably just a Ukrainian sympathizer in this regard. So we can expect more prosecution of pro-Ukrainian, anti-Russian Ukrainians that are under Russian control as of now. And the office of the Ukrainian Ukrainian Prosecutor Generals has said on the 8th of November, in documents that were left behind in Izium, it became clear that the Russians are trying to get good students, so I guess with good grades, and deport them to camps on the Crimea and to Belgorod to educate them and to allow them relaxation. Obviously, it includes the accusation that this is deportation and re-education of basically taking the next generation's brain draining the next generation of Ukrainians in this regard as well, going back to the Ukrainian accusation that Russia is doing genocide, which according to international regulations, trying to destroy the identity of a people is genocide, which Russia is trying to do in Ukraine. And when we come to support, we have an Iranian News report that the secretary of the Russian Security Council, Nikolai Patrushev, has arrived in Tehran, so the capital of Iran, for negotiations for further support. This is kind of important in a regard as it's allowing the Iranians to say, look how much the balance of power has shifted. Hossein Soleimani, the head, I don't think he was the head, but like a high general of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps. I think he was responsible for every operation outside of Iran. And he was actually so successful that his nickname in the Middle East was Supermani. He was killed by the US military under President Donald Trump, as you might recall. He flew, I think in 2015, to Russia, to Moscow, to ask the Russians for help in Syria. And now it's the other way. Now the Russians come to Iran to ask for help, which obviously indicates a shift in the balance of power between the two nations. The accusations are from outside of Iran that Iran is asking for Russian help, though when it comes to suppressing the protests that are shaking Iran for several weeks already, and Russia from its side, Russia itself is asking for more weapons, for more Iranian weapons, not just loitering munitions, suicide drones as they are commonly called, but there supposedly are also negotiations about the delivery of ballistic missiles from Iran. Russia, there's a report, I think it's from British media, that Russia has delivered NLAW, Stinger and Javelin to Iran, and in return they were supposed to receive, I think, 260 Shahed 136 loitering munitions. The idea is, the accusation is, Russia is delivering those weapons to allow reverse engineering to the Iranians, who have been fairly successful at reverse engineering Western equipment that fell into their hands, from cruise missiles to drones to even aircraft, even though their innovation part when it comes to developing new weapons has been somewhat limited. When it comes to the reverse engineering, they have a lot of experience doing that. So the expectation would be that Iran might be able to produce the weapons in a few years. I've read an article about that though, and it was said it's one thing though to reverse engineer, to understand how the system works, to basically make a big list which items we need and how those items work, and it's a whole different story whether or not you mass produce them, whether you not just build two that work but actually create them in bulk in serial production, and that's supposedly far more difficult. So whether the Iranians will actually be able to produce hundreds, if not thousands, of Javelin, NLAW, or Stinger, something comparable to it, is obviously a big different question. And then again, Stinger is not obsolete yet, but it's really fairly old technology. That so old that I think Raytheon is the producer. They had to re-engineer it, as now new orders were coming in after the Stinger missile being suddenly back in high demand. Germany, there's a further report for Ukraine though. Germany is now sending 30 Dingos. It's not really an MRAP, but it could probably be compared to that. So it's a 4x4 built on a truck chassis of the famous Unimog. So it's really has good ground clearance, is capable of going off-road to a certain degree. It has an armored chassis, but it's only armored enough against small arms fire. It's not an IFV, it's more an APC, like a battle taxi, a lightly armored battle taxi. Germany has delivered 30 Dingos to Ukraine. Also, they delivered Iris-T, further Iris-T missiles for the air defense system, and 42 mine clearing trucks, machinery. And France has promised 6 further César self-propelled howitzers. That's it for now. Long enough, I think. Longer than the usual 40 minutes in the situation report. We're at 1 hour now. This channel though is only possible because of the support from viewers like you. So if you like what you see, if you enjoy that, then I would really appreciate you supporting the channel by the means said in the description. Thank you so much to everyone already supporting it. And you can also support the channel by giving it a thumbs up, by leaving comments, by discussing whether or not you think this means the end, the beginning of the end, or the end of the beginning of this war. the loss of Kherson, which is to be expected within the next few days. The comments are not just really interesting, the discussions that are there are often bringing new expectations, new viewpoints in the whole thing, but they're also really helping with the algorithm. And if you haven't subscribed yet, I want to invite you to subscribe to the channel. Don't forget the bell icon so you don't miss future videos, and recommend the channel to your friends and acquaintances. That's it from me for now. Thank you for watching, and I'll be back.